Hello and welcome. Tonight, I will guide you into a long, calm journey through the history of the Vikings. Not the loud history we see in tales of battles and horns and roaring seas, but a soft, quiet, deeply human history. A history that shaped the North, carried stories across oceans, and left marks on Europe that still survive today. Before we begin, I want to say, if you enjoy these peaceful, immersive journeys into the past, I would be truly grateful if you subscribe to support the channel. It means a lot. Thank you. Now, take a slow breath, let your shoulders relax, and let your thoughts dissolve into the gentle rhythm of the northern world. Imagine the far north, long before cities, long before noisy highways, long before electricity. Imagine a world where the air is cold and clear, where pine forests stretch for miles in every direction, where fjords carve deep paths between towering mountains, and where winter nights last long enough for a person to forget where the horizon ends. It was in this world, more than 1,200 years ago, that the people we now call the Vikings began to shape their lives. They did not call themselves Vikings, this is important. They called themselves Norsemen or simply folk of the North. The word Viking originally meant to go on an expedition, and it was used more as a verb than a noun. To go Viking meant to leave home on a journey, sometimes to trade, sometimes to explore, and yes, sometimes to raid. But their history is far more than raids. It is a story of families, of farms, of longhouses, of blue twilight skies, of myths told by hearth fires, and of brave, curious spirits who wondered what lay beyond the horizon. Close your eyes gently and imagine a Scandinavian village around the year 750. It is early morning in midsummer. The sun never fully sets during this season. Instead, a soft golden glow lingers through the night. You can hear the gentle sound of waves brushing the rocky shore and the distant call of seabirds drifting over the water. Wooden houses stand close together, each built of logs, each roof covered in thick turf that helps keep warmth inside during winter. Smoke rises from a chimney as someone lights the morning fire. Children run barefoot along the grassy paths between homes. Women grind grain with large stone wheels. Men repair nets and wooden fences. Life is calm, modest, and centered around family and community. For most Norse people, this peaceful daily life, not fighting, is what defined their world. But beyond these quiet villages lies a harder truth. The land is beautiful, but not easy. The soil is thin. Winters are long. Food can be scarce. Many families grow barley and rye, raise sheep and goats, and fish in the cold northern seas. But life is always a delicate balance with nature. It is from this environment, demanding, cold, breathtaking, that the Viking spirit was born. The desire to explore, to trade, to search for new lands was not simply an adventurous impulse. It was survival, curiosity, and ambition woven together. When you imagine Vikings, do not imagine endless war. Imagine people who looked at an unforgiving world and asked themselves where else they might go. As you breathe slowly, imagine their ships, the most remarkable symbol of their history. Longships, with elegant curves and wooden planks overlapping like the scales of a fish. They were light, fast, and flexible, able to cross stormy oceans yet also travel up shallow rivers. Their hulls creaked softly with every wave, and their sails, dyed deep red or brown, caught the wind like the wings of great birds. These ships were not simply tools. They were expressions of ingenious craftsmanship. Every plank was shaped by hand, every nail forged in fire, every rope twisted from plant fibers collected by patient hands. When a longship rested on the shore, children played in its shadow. When it was prepared for the sea, the entire village worked together, lifting, pushing, guiding, until the ship slid gently into the water. It is quiet now. The fjord reflects the pale morning light. The longship glides forward with almost no sound. A crew of men, young and old, row in soft unison. Their oars dip into the water with a rhythm so steady it almost resembles breathing. This was the beginning of the Viking Age. Not a single dramatic moment, but many small departures of ships like this one, moving step by step farther from home. First to nearby islands, then to the coasts of Britain, then to the rivers of Francia. The Norse discovered lands like Iceland and Greenland. They traveled through the rivers of Eastern Europe to reach the rich markets of the Byzantine Empire. Some settled in Ireland, some reached the Mediterranean, and long before Columbus, Norse explorers reached North America, calling it Vinland. But despite these grand achievements, the heart of Viking history is still in their quiet, everyday world. Their beliefs, for example, were woven gently into daily life. They believed the world was shaped from the body of a primordial giant. They believed 9 realms were connected by Yggdrasil, the great world tree that reached into the sky and down into the deepest roots of the earth. They believed Odin wandered the world in disguise, seeking knowledge. They believed Thor protected humanity from the cold giants of the north. But these myths were not just stories. They were companions, whispered during long winter nights when storms pressed against the walls of the longhouse. Imagine sitting beside a Viking hearth, a low fire burning, sparks drifting upward like small orange stars, shadows swaying softly across the wooden beams above. A storyteller begins to speak, and everyone grows quiet. The story is slow, steady, rhythmic, the perfect pace for a long night. As the Viking world expanded, their settlements grew more complex. Trading centers formed along the coasts, places like Hedeby, Birka, Koppang. Markets filled with beads made from faraway sands. Silk traded from merchants who themselves had traveled across continents. Silver coins bearing foreign symbols. Amber collected from the cold Baltic shores. These markets were full of languages and faces from distant lands. The Norse people learned new customs, taught others their own, and spread across Europe not only through force, but through exchange, cooperation, and intermarriage. And yet, no matter how far they traveled, home was always the quiet northern village, the one lit by the soft glow of a hearth. A place where the walls of the longhouse held a warmth that felt timeless. A place where the sound of waves against the shore was a constant lullaby. A place where winter nights wrapped the world in deep blue darkness, and summer mornings brought endless golden light. This home was the center of all Viking life, the anchor to which they always returned as the Viking Age progressed. Certain leaders rose to shape history. People like Harald Fairhair in Norway, who sought to unite scattered clans under one crown. People like Rollo, who traveled to France, where he would eventually be given land that became Normandy. People like Eric the Red, who sailed west to discover Greenland, and his son Leif Erikson, who continued even farther to the shores of North America. But in the quiet world of daily life, these names were less important than the steady rhythm of survival. Gathering firewood, tending sheep, spinning wool, repairing tools, telling stories, raising children. Now imagine night falling in a Norse village. The sky deepens from blue to navy to almost black. Stars scatter across the heavens, bright and cold. The northern air wraps around everything with a crisp stillness. Inside the longhouse, a family settles down. The fire burns low. The children lie beneath warm blankets of wool and fur. The adults whisper softly, their voices gentle and tired. The room glows a soft amber from the last embers. This is where Viking history truly lived, in these peaceful moments that the world often forgets. The Vikings were humans, just like us. They laughed, they worried, they dreamed, they loved. They carved runes into wood to send messages. They wore simple jewelry made of bronze or glass. They sang old songs during feasts. They stood in silence during funerals. They watched the sky change with the passing seasons and wondered what the future would hold as you breathe slowly now. Imagine their world not as a distant legend, but as a real, living place. A place filled with warmth and cold, light and shadow, hardship and beauty. A place where the rhythm of life moved with the tides and with the winds. A place that shaped the history of Scandinavia, the British Isles, Eastern Europe, and even parts of the Middle East. A place that continues to inspire stories today. The Viking Age, like all ages, eventually came to an end. Not suddenly, but gently over time. Kings consolidated power, societies changed, Christianity spread, and new ways of life replaced old traditions. Yet the echoes of the Viking world remain, in languages, in place names, in stories, in artifacts discovered beneath the earth, in the shape of ships reconstructed in museums, and in the imagination of everyone who looks north and wonders what life must have felt like in that ancient, quiet world. Now allow your breath to deepen, allow your body to soften, and let the gentle history of the Vikings settle into your mind like falling snow. This is only the beginning. As you breathe softly and let your mind settle into the quiet flow of the story, imagine the early northern world continuing to grow and shift, shaping the people who would one day be known across continents as the Vikings. Their history did not begin with the sudden appearance of longships on foreign shores, but with centuries of slow, steady change in the lands of Scandinavia. Long before the first recorded voyages, small communities were learning to adapt to the rhythms of the seasons, to the limited fertile soil, and to the shifting fortunes of the northern climate. In these early centuries, the people of the North developed a unique relationship with their environment, one built on resilience, cooperation, and an intimate knowledge of the land. Imagine the coasts of Norway rising steeply from the sea, the mountains carved by ancient ice, and the deep fjords serving as natural pathways into the interior. Along these shores, families built simple farms, growing barley, oats, and rye in the thin soil. Farther east, in what would become Sweden, dense forests stretched for miles, home to elk, bears, wolves, and countless birds that migrated with the seasons. Rivers ran cold and clear, connecting inland settlements to the Baltic Sea. And in the flat, open landscapes of Denmark, early communities established themselves near gentle coasts and fertile fields. Day by day, season by season, these scattered settlements became the foundation of Norse society. As you relax deeper, imagine the gentle cadence of their daily life. A quiet morning mist hangs above grazing animals. Wooden homes built with simple, strong craftsmanship stand clustered together for warmth against winter storms. The sound of grinding grain fills the air as corn stones turn slowly. Fishermen pull in nets heavy with cod and herring, their boats rocking gently on calm waters. The pace of life is slow, measured, and deeply tied to nature. Such rhythms shaped the Norse mind, patient, observant, practical, and aware that survival depended on both individual effort and collective strength. In these early centuries, long before the Viking Age officially began, the Norse people were already developing the traits that would define them: master craftsmanship, a deep understanding of wood and water, and an ability to read the sky and sea with remarkable intuition. Boats were central to their world. Even simple ones allowed travel between small communities scattered along the coastlines. The sea connected people more easily than the rugged land. This maritime lifestyle would eventually evolve into one of the most sophisticated seafaring traditions of the early medieval world. As time flowed forward, slowly and steadily, trade began to weave its way into Scandinavian life. Travelers from the south and east brought bronze, silver, glass beads, and pottery. In exchange, the Norse offered furs, amber, and iron tools forged in small rural workshops. These early exchanges were modest, but they planted seeds of change, introducing new ideas, new materials, and a curiosity about the world beyond the forests and fjords. The Norse people learned that there were vast lands beyond their horizons, places where wealth, knowledge, and opportunity awaited. This awareness stirred something deep within them, a quiet desire to see what lay beyond the familiar. Meanwhile, their society continued to grow more structured. Families, known as kindreds, formed the core of social life, each one tied together by shared ancestry and mutual responsibilities. The Thing, a kind of local assembly, allowed free men to gather and make decisions, settle disputes, and discuss community matters. These assemblies created a sense of shared culture and collective identity across the scattered villages. Although no unified kingdom existed yet, the seeds of future political structures were beginning to form. As generations passed, Norse craftsmanship grew more refined. Metal workers perfected the art of forging strong, flexible iron. Woodworkers developed techniques to shape curved planks that could bend and move with the waves. These innovations, introduced gradually over many years, transformed the Nordic boat from a simple coastal vessel into the prototype of the longship, a masterpiece of engineering that would later allow the Vikings to travel astonishing distances with incredible speed. While you breathe slowly, imagine one of these early longships taking shape. In a quiet clearing near the water's edge, tall pine trees are cut by skilled hands. The logs are split, shaped, and smoothed. Every plank is fitted with care, overlapping in the clinker-built style that gives the ship strength and flexibility. Iron rivets are hammered into place with rhythm reminiscent of a heartbeat. A keel is laid, then ribs, then planks that curve gently upward on both ends. Over weeks and months, a graceful form emerges, light, sturdy, and capable of sliding effortlessly across the sea. When the ship is finally completed, it glows with fresh tar and catches the light in soft brown and golden tones. Villagers gather to watch it glide into the water for the first time, its hull meeting the sea with the quiet kiss of wood-touching waves. This moment, simple, silent, and almost ceremonial, is one of the quiet beginnings of the Viking Age. It did not start with raiding. It started with shipbuilding, with skill, with curiosity, with the desire to explore. By the late 700s, the Norse world had changed enough that expansion became not only possible but increasingly appealing. Population grew slowly but steadily, and families needed more land than the rugged Scandinavian landscape could provide. Younger sons, who often inherited little, looked outward for opportunities. Seasonal journeys, once confined to local trade and fishing, extended farther each year. A gentle widening of horizons was underway. And then, with this widening, came the first voyages abroad. As you relax deeper into this calm flow of history, imagine the early explorers setting out on quiet mornings, pushing their ships into the cold sea. The air is crisp, the sky is pale. The longship glides forward with almost no sound. Rowers pull gently, their strokes smooth and practiced. The coastline slips behind them. At first they travel to nearby islands, the Shetlands, the Faroes, the Orkneys. These journeys were not dramatic events, but natural extensions of their maritime world. People settled where they found land suitable for farming, building new homes that looked like the ones they had left behind. As seasons turned into years, word spread among coastal communities of lands farther away, lands with rich soil, mild climates, and prosperous towns. The Norse listened with quiet interest. Their world had taught them self-reliance, but also adaptability. And so they began to travel farther still. The English coast, the rivers of Ireland, the Baltic shores. Each voyage was a blend of exploration, trade, negotiation, and occasionally conflict. But even at the beginning of these ventures, the core identity of the Norse remained rooted in home. Their history is not just a tapestry of expansion, but also a deep, steady commitment to the rhythms of village life. The majority of Norse people never set foot in a longship bound for foreign shores. They stayed near their farms, tending barley in the short summer, caring for sheep and cows, preparing food for winter, and listening to elders recount the stories of older days. While a portion of the population ventured outward, the heart of Norse society continued beating quietly in these small communities. During this period, their belief system also grew more elaborate. Their gods reflected aspects of the world they knew intimately. Odin, the seeker of wisdom, mirrored their own curiosity. Thor, the protector against giants and storms, symbolized their battle against harsh winters. Freyr and Freya represented fertility, love, and the earth's renewal after long, cold months. These deities were woven into daily life not with strict dogma but with quiet rituals. Offerings at small altars, carved symbols on wood, whispered blessings before voyages, and stories passed from mouth to ear during long winter nights as the Norse world expanded through trade. Contact with new cultures enriched their own. They encountered the Franks, the Anglo-Saxons, the Slavs, and the distant traders of the Mediterranean. New ideas, technologies, and customs flowed into Scandinavian harbors. Silver coins from Arabia circulated in the markets of Birka. Silk from the east found its way into Danish graves. Even small details, like new styles of brooches or new methods of weaving, traveled along these routes. Yet through all of this, Norse identity remained strong, shaped by the land that had forged them. The sounds of creaking timber, the scent of pine resin, the crash of waves against rocky shores, these elements formed the soundtrack of their lives. No matter how far they traveled, they carried these memories with them like invisible luggage as you continue breathing gently. Imagine the Norse returning home after months or years away. Their longships approach the familiar fjord. The mountains rise like old companions. Smoke from hearths curls into the air. Families gather at the shoreline, shading their eyes against the sun. When the ships touch land, greetings are exchanged in warm, quiet tones. Relief, joy, and gratitude blending together. Stories of distant lands are told slowly around fires, with the same calm cadence that had shaped this culture for generations. This balance, between home and journey, between familiarity and exploration, is what gave Viking history its unique character. It is a story not only of bold movement outward but of deep roots inward, of people shaped by winters, by ocean spray, by myth and memory, by stone and soil, by the simple act of living close to nature as the early Viking age unfolds. It does so not with loud triumphs but with countless soft steps taken across coastlines, rivers, and forests. Quiet choices, quiet journeys, quiet evolutions. This calm foundation is what would later make the explosive expansion of the Vikings possible. Their history is, at its core, a long, slow breath, one that rises, expands, and reaches far before slowly settling again. And with this gentle understanding, we prepare to move even deeper into their world. When you're ready, I will continue into the next chapter, where the Viking Age emerges fully and their influence spreads across Europe and beyond. As the Viking Age moved into its early centuries, the world surrounding Scandinavia began to shift in ways that would guide the Norse people farther than they had ever imagined. What had begun as small exploratory journeys slowly transformed into a broader pattern of movement, expansion, and influence that touched nearly every corner of Northern Europe. Yet even as their presence began to be felt beyond their home shores, the process was gradual, quiet, and deeply interconnected with the natural rhythms of their society. To understand this era, imagine the soft unfolding of time, like the slow rise of the sun on a northern morning, spreading light across distant horizons. The North Sea, the Baltic, and the Norwegian Sea formed the watery highways of this transformation. These bodies of water were, to the Norse, not barriers but pathways, broad, ever-present companions that connected communities and allowed ideas to flow freely. The sea held both danger and opportunity, but for people who grew up at its edge, it was familiar, almost comforting. Children learned its moods as naturally as they learned to walk. They listened to the sound of waves breaking on stone, the shift in wind before a storm, the distant cries of seabirds returning to their cliffs. In this environment, the art of seamanship was not exotic or rare. It was part of life that as you breathe softly. Picture a quiet Scandinavian harbor in the early 800s. A longship lies at anchor, its hull gently rising and falling with the motion of the water. The sail is furled, tied neatly with ropes twisted from animal hair and plant fibers. The wooden mast stands tall and smooth, reflecting the pale morning light. Around the harbor, fishermen work silently, their hands practiced and efficient. Women carry baskets of dried fish, wool, and woven cloth. Children chase each other between stacks of timber, laughing softly. The activity is gentle, steady, and completely absorbed into the rhythm of the sea. Yet from scenes like this, voyages would begin, voyages that would slowly shape the map of medieval Europe. The first places touched by these journeys were nearby: the British Isles, the northern coasts of Scotland, the Shetland Islands, the Orkneys, and Ireland. These coasts, rugged and windswept, were not so different from the homelands of the Norse. They offered good harbors, fertile land, and opportunities for trade. Norse merchants brought furs, amber, iron, and walrus ivory. In return, they obtained silver, wine, fine cloth, and tools crafted in the kingdoms of the British Isles. Exchange took many forms, sometimes peaceful, sometimes tense, but always shaped by the tides of opportunity and necessity. While some Norse groups settled in Ireland and Scotland, others traveled east across the Baltic Sea. Swedish Vikings, often called Russ, navigated the vast river networks of Eastern Europe. Imagine their ships gliding up wide rivers bordered by forests that seemed endless, their waters dark and reflective like polished stone. These rivers, Neva, Fokhov, Dnieper, and Volga, became pathways into lands where Slavic tribes lived, and farther south, where the Byzantine Empire traded silk, spices, and luxuries from distant lands. The Norse carried furs, honey, wax, iron, and slaves, exchanging them in bustling markets where dozens of languages blended together in soft layers of sound. Their ability to navigate both sea and river made them uniquely adaptable, and soon they were founding settlements, establishing trading posts, and influencing the politics of regions far from home. But not all Norse expansion was driven by trade. Some communities grew large enough that land became scarce, especially in Norway, where steep mountains limited the amount of accessible farmland. Younger sons, who often inherited little or nothing, found themselves looking outward for opportunities. They sailed west, into the cold, open North Atlantic, where they discovered islands that no one else had settled. First came the Faroe Islands, a chain of green cliffs rising sharply from the ocean. Then Iceland, a vast island of volcanic rock, steaming hot springs, black sand beaches, and fertile valleys between snow-covered mountains. The Norse who reached Iceland found it empty of human habitation, a blank canvas on which they built a new society. Over time, Iceland would become one of the most culturally rich centers of Norse tradition, preserving sagas, laws, and stories that continue to inform our understanding of Viking history today. The spirit of exploration carried the Norse even farther. Greenland, a land of glaciers, icebergs, and short summers, became another distant settlement. And beyond that, carried by winds and currents, Norse explorers reached the shores of North America, places they called Helluland, Markland, and Vinland. These were lands of forests, rivers, and wild-growing grapes, strange and beautiful to the northern travelers. Although these settlements did not last, their existence speaks to the incredible range of Norse movement, the quiet determination that pushed them to the very edges of the known world as their influence spread. Norse culture developed in complexity and depth. Their craftsmanship reached new heights. Ornate brooches made of bronze decorated with interwoven patterns, swords forged with skill that created blades strong enough to survive generations, and carvings on wood and bone that depicted scenes from their myths and daily life. Their language, Old Norse, was spoken across wide territories, leaving behind words that survive in modern English, Norwegian, Swedish, Icelandic, and other languages. Simple words like sky, window, knife, husband, and even Thursday echo the sounds of Norse speech. Their mythology, too, grew richer through centuries of storytelling, blending belief and imagination in ways that shaped their worldview. As you relax deeper, imagine the Norse evening scenes that took place across settlements from Norway to Ireland to Iceland. A fire crackles softly in the center of a longhouse. Families gather around it, warming their hands, sharing food, and listening to stories told in low, soothing tones. Someone recites a tale of Odin sacrificing an eye for wisdom. Someone else remembers the thunder of Thor's hammer, protecting the world from chaotic forces. These stories were not only entertainment, they were a quiet way of understanding the world, of facing the uncertainties of nature, of expressing courage, fear, and hope. Politically, the Norse world also shifted during the Viking Age. In Norway, local chieftains grew in power, forming alliances and rivalries that would eventually lead to the unification of the country under Harald Fairhair. In Denmark, kings consolidated control over the Jutland Peninsula and surrounding islands, creating one of the earliest stable monarchies in the region. In Sweden, powerful families ruled over trading centers and inland communities, gradually forming the foundations of a future kingdom. These political changes were slow and steady, unfolding across generations, shaped by marriage, negotiation, conflict, and the evolving needs of the people. Yet through all of this, the essence of Norse life remained grounded in simple, meaningful routines. Families continued to gather harvests, care for animals, build and repair homes, and raise children who learned the same skills their ancestors had practiced for centuries. The majority of Norse people were not warriors or travelers. They were farmers, fishers, artisans, and storytellers. Their lives were shaped by the land and the sea, by the quiet passing of seasons, by the shared responsibilities that kept communities strong. The Viking Age was never a single story. It was a vast, intricate tapestry of exploration and settlement, of trade and craftsmanship, of mythology and daily life, woven together over nearly 3 centuries. And as time continued to drift forward, the world around Scandinavia shifted once more, beginning the gradual transition that would bring the Viking Age to its close. But that part of the story comes later. For now, let the gentle unfolding of this era linger in your mind. The slow spread of longships across the seas, the quiet forging of new communities, the blending of cultures, and the deep roots of Norse identity that shaped every moment of this extraordinary chapter in history. As your breath remains calm and steady, imagine the map of the northern world expanding softly like ripples on water, carrying the Norse people into distant lands and leaving traces that still remain today. As the Viking Age moved into its height, the world of the Norse touched more lands, more cultures, and more histories than ever before. The quiet expansions of earlier centuries had formed the foundation, but now a larger and more interconnected network emerged across Europe. Yet even at this peak, the story is not one of constant conflict or relentless conquest, but rather of gradual shaping, adapting, and blending with the societies they encountered. To understand this era, imagine the rhythm of waves continually touching new shores, each arrival subtle, each movement a continuation of the same quiet strength that defined the Norse by the late 800s and early 900s. Viking activity had become a familiar presence in many parts of Europe. Along the coasts of England, settlements began to grow where Norse farmers lived beside the local population, adopting agricultural techniques and exchanging knowledge about the land. The so-called Danelaw emerged in eastern England, an area where Danish traditions, laws, and customs blended with Anglo-Saxon ways. The presence of the Norse became woven into daily life. Place names, agricultural methods, and even parts of the English language bear the imprint of this period. Yet this was not the sudden imposition of a foreign force. It was a slow merging shaped by years of interaction, trade, intermarriage, and the practical cooperation required for shared survival in Ireland. The Norse founded towns that would later become some of the most important cities of the island. Dublin, for instance, began as a Viking settlement, a hub of trade and craftsmanship. The Norse brought new techniques in shipbuilding, metalwork, and commerce, connecting Irish markets to broader trade networks across the North Sea and beyond. These towns were not isolated. They became part of a vibrant, multicultural exchange. Goods, ideas, and people moved through them quietly, like the gentle flow of a river bringing fresh currents to a familiar shore. Farther to the east, Swedish Vikings continued traveling along the river systems that connected Scandinavia to the Black Sea and the lands of the Byzantine Empire. Their journeys were long, moving through dense forests, across open plains, and past fortified towns. At times their ships had to be carried over land between rivers, the hulls sliding across wooden rollers as men pushed with steady, deliberate effort. These portage routes were physically demanding but vital in linking distant markets. Over time, Norse traders and settlers became deeply integrated into the societies they encountered. Some served as mercenaries in the Byzantine military and became known as the Varangian Guard, a unit renowned for its loyalty and skill. Their presence in Constantinople, a city of libraries, palaces, and bustling markets, exposed them to forms of art, architecture, and religion far different from those of the northern world. Meanwhile, the Western expansion continued to unfold. In France, the Norse presence gradually transformed into something new. Instead of remaining outsiders, they were granted land in the region that became Normandy, where Norse rulers adopted the French language, converted to Christianity, and built a hybrid culture that blended Norman ambition with Scandinavian resilience. Over generations, the descendants of these Norse settlers would play significant roles in European history, shaping political events far beyond the shores their ancestors had first reached in longships. The Norse who settled in Iceland developed a unique society built on freedom, law, and storytelling. With no king to rule over them, they formed the Althing, one of the earliest parliamentary systems in the world. Each summer, leaders, farmers, and families gathered in an open valley to settle disputes, recite laws, and share news. The environment of Iceland, isolated, volcanic, rugged, encouraged a spirit of self-reliance and cooperation. Over the centuries, the Icelandic sagas were written, preserving detailed accounts of early settlers, family histories, and voyages across the sea. These sagas are calm, deliberate, and deeply rooted in the landscape, much like the people who created them. Greenland, though harsher and more distant, also saw Norse settlement. Farmers raised sheep and cattle in the few suitable valleys, hunted seals and walrus for ivory, and maintained contact with Iceland and Norway. The Greenland settlements were smaller and more fragile, but they reflected the same spirit of adaptability that characterized the Norse expansion. They remained active for centuries, quietly persisting in a world of ice, cliffs, and long winters as you breathe slowly and let your mind drift deeper into this soft historical landscape. Imagine the countless interactions that shaped this era. Norse traders offering furs and iron in distant markets, craftsmen shaping jewelry with interlaced patterns, farmers tending fields in new lands where winters were milder and crops grew more readily, children learning the languages of their neighbors, blending words into a shared vocabulary, quiet evenings in homes warmed by fires, where stories were told in voices that mixed Norse tradition with new influences gathered from distant places. The world was changing in subtle ways, and the Norse were both shapers and shaped, Christianity began to spread into Scandinavia, brought by missionaries, traders, and returning settlers who had encountered the faith abroad. At first, the new religion was another idea among many, accepted slowly, debated in assemblies, discussed by families. Over time, kings and chieftains realized the political advantages of uniting their lands under a single faith. Gradually, churches were built beside old temples, and crosses appeared where once only runestones stood. This transition was not sudden or uniform. It unfolded village by village, generation by generation, blending old beliefs with new ones, until the spiritual landscape of the North had quietly transformed. As political structures solidified, the independent chieftains who had once ruled small regions began to be replaced by more centralized authorities. Kings emerged in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, their power built on alliances, taxation, and evolving military systems. These emerging kingdoms brought more stability, more structure, and more connection with the broader European world. They also signaled the beginning of a shift away from the decentralized networks that had defined much of the Viking Age. Yet throughout this transformation, the essence of Norse culture persisted. The longhouse remained the center of rural life. Boats remained essential for travel and trade. The seasons continued to guide work and rest, and the deep respect for craftsmanship, for community, and for the natural world endured. Even as new influences flowed into Scandinavia, the roots of Norse identity held firm, grounding the people in traditions that stretched back centuries. Gradually, as the 10th and 11th centuries unfolded, the Viking Age approached its natural close. It did so not with sudden collapse, but with a slow, gentle shift as societies changed, economies evolved, and political structures matured. The energy that had once driven longships across oceans now flowed into the building of towns, the construction of churches, and the development of written law codes. Exploration gave way to settlement. Raiding gave way to governance. The far-reaching wanderings of earlier generations settled into more local rhythms. Still, the presence of the Norse did not disappear. It simply transformed. Their descendants continued to influence the world through trade, leadership, art, and culture. Their languages evolved into modern Scandinavian tongues. Their stories were written down, preserved in sagas and poems that continue to whisper across time, and their impact on the lands they touched remained woven into place names, traditions, and historical memory. As your breath rises and falls gently, imagine the Viking Age as a long wave that slowly built, spread across distant shores, and then gradually receded, leaving behind countless traces of its passage. Every ship that crossed a sea, every settlement founded on foreign soil, every trade made in a distant marketplace became part of a larger tapestry. A tapestry woven not only with momentum but with moments of quiet determination, resilience, curiosity, and adaptation. And in this soft understanding, we can continue the journey into the final centuries of the Viking Age, exploring how the Norse world integrated into medieval Europe and how its legacy endured long after the last longship returned home. As the 11th century approached, the world that had once seemed vast and uncharted to the Norse people began to feel more familiar, more interconnected, shaped by centuries of movement across land and sea. The Viking Age was entering its later phase, not with abrupt change, but in a gradual, gentle evolution that unfolded across generations. The forces that had once pushed longships toward unknown coastlines were now guiding societies toward new forms of governance, new beliefs, and new social structures. And just as the tides shift subtly yet irresistibly, so too did the world of the Vikings begin transitioning into something different, woven still with the threads of the past, yet stretching toward a new future. Imagine Scandinavia in the late 900s and early 1000s. Small villages, still clustered along the coasts and nestled between forests, continued their timeless rhythms. Farmers rose early, guided by the sun or by the soft glow of lamps during winter. Fishermen set out into cold, misty waters. Craftsmen shaped metal into tools, ornaments, and weapons, each strike of the hammer echoing through wooden workshops. Yet the quiet hum of daily life was gradually surrounded by new sounds. Bells ringing from small wooden churches built beside older sacred groves, scribes in monasteries copying texts, merchants discussing foreign coinage that now circulated more widely, and messengers carrying news from emerging centers of political authority, Christianity, which had slowly seeped into the north during earlier centuries through trade and contact, now spread more visibly. Kings realized that adopting the new faith brought diplomatic advantages, eased relations with powerful Christian neighbors, and provided a unified framework for law and governance. Conversion was not sudden. It happened gradually, often peacefully, sometimes symbolically. A chieftain might agree to be baptized in exchange for political support. A family might adopt Christian names while still holding on to older traditions. A village might build a simple church while continuing to observe seasonal customs with ancient roots. Over time, the two belief systems blended, creating a transitional cultural landscape that felt familiar yet changing. As you breathe slowly, imagine the soft blending of cultures. A wooden church stands where once only a sacred tree stood. The sound of hymns mixes with the old stories still told in the evenings. Runes are carved on stones beside crosses. Old and new coexisted for a time, overlapping gently like layers of calm water moving in different directions, each shaping the other without abrupt interruption. Meanwhile, political structures in Scandinavia grew stronger. Kings in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden expanded their influence by forging alliances with local leaders, controlling trade routes, and building towns that served as administrative and economic centers. These emerging kingdoms reduced the decentralization that had characterized earlier centuries. Local chieftains, once independent and influential, gradually became part of larger political systems. This consolidation brought more stability but also changed the dynamics of society. Power became more centralized, taxation more organized, and military forces more regulated. In Denmark, the reign of King Harald Bluetooth marked a significant turning point. He is credited with uniting Danish territories and converting his kingdom to Christianity. His accomplishments were commemorated on the large gelling stones, carved with runes and decorated with intricate designs. These stones still stand today, silent and monumental, echoing messages from a world in transition. They represent the merging of the Old Norse world with the new Christian order, captured in carefully carved symbols that blend tradition with change. In Norway, the consolidation of power was more turbulent. Kings worked to unite regions separated by mountains, fjords, and long-standing local identities. The process involved conflict, negotiation, and shifting alliances, yet the long-term effect was a gradual strengthening of central authority. Over time, traveling assemblies, legal reforms, and shared religious institutions helped weave the scattered communities of Norway into a more cohesive whole. Sweden, too, slowly transformed from a mosaic of small chieftaincies into a more structured kingdom. Trade with the Baltic and Eastern Europe continued to be a major influence, shaping political and economic decisions. Swedish connections with the Slavic and Byzantine worlds remained strong, sustaining networks that had existed for generations. As the internal structure of Scandinavia changed, the outward momentum of Viking expansion softened. Fewer men left home to join distant raids or exploratory voyages. Instead, many turned their attention to farming, trade, and participation in the emerging political systems. Towns grew larger, markets became more organized, craftsmen specialized in metalwork, textile production, and shipbuilding for commercial rather than military use. Life became more stable, less defined by seasonal expeditions and more oriented toward long-term settlement and governance. Still, the Norse legacy abroad continued to evolve. In England, Norse and Anglo-Saxon cultures blended deeply, especially in regions under Danelaw influence. Linguistic blending produced new words, new dialects, and new place names. Legal practices incorporated aspects of both traditions. Families merged across cultural lines, creating a population that carried multiple heritages within a single identity. In Normandy, the descendants of Norse settlers, now culturally and linguistically French, played an increasingly important role in European politics. Their military and administrative skills, honed over generations, positioned them as influential leaders in medieval Europe. Although they no longer identified as Vikings, their roots in Scandinavia shaped their approach to governance, expansion, and cultural adaptation. In the East, Norse influence persisted through the trading networks they had established. The Varangian Guard continued to serve the Byzantine emperors, renowned for their discipline and loyalty. Their presence in Constantinople symbolized the deep, enduring ties between the northern and southern worlds, connections forged through centuries of travel, commerce, and mutual respect. As you continue to breathe softly, imagine the Viking Age now in its later, quieter years. The great voyages had slowed. The longships still existed, but many were used for peaceful trade rather than far-reaching raids. The distant settlements in the North Atlantic carried on their local routines: farming, fishing, building homes from turf and stone, and observing the turning of the seasons. Stories from earlier centuries, of storms faced on open seas and discoveries in distant lands, were told with a calm reverence, becoming more legend than memory. The Norse sense of identity matured. What had once been defined by exploration and expansion now centered more on law, order, faith, and cultural continuity. Written laws emerged in Iceland and Norway, transforming oral traditions into structured legal codes. Poetry and sagas continued to develop, capturing history, mythology, and family stories with remarkable detail and artistry. Craftsmen refined their techniques, producing objects that balanced function and beauty. Brooches with interwoven patterns, carved wooden panels, finely woven textiles dyed with natural colors from plants and minerals. As the Viking Age drew closer to its quiet end, Europe was shifting too. Stronger kingdoms rose in the south. Trade routes expanded. Political alliances evolved. The Norse world was no longer on the edge of Europe, but fully part of it. Their ships still traveled, their markets still operated, and their culture still thrived, but the era of dramatic expansion had passed. Yet the spirit of the Viking Age, its curiosity, its adaptability, its craftsmanship, and its deep connection to the natural world, remained woven into the identities of Scandinavia. Even as the last horizons were reached, and the final longships returned home, the essence of the age lived on in the people who carried its stories forward. And so, with the gentle closing of this chapter, the Viking Age approached its final centuries. But its legacy, far from fading, continued to grow in new forms, carried into the medieval world and far beyond. As the later years of the Viking Age unfolded, the transformation of Scandinavia into a more unified and interconnected region became increasingly visible. The shifts that had begun quietly centuries earlier were now shaping the daily lives, beliefs, and political structures of the Norse people. This was not a moment of abrupt endings, but a long twilight period in which the traditions of the past gradually blended with the emerging realities of the medieval world. The transition carried the same gentle, persistent rhythm that had long defined northern life, moving forward like the slow retreat of winter before the approach of spring. By the early 11th century, Christianity was firmly rooted across much of Scandinavia. Churches stood in places that once hosted open-air rituals. Bells rang softly over valleys where offerings had once been made beneath sacred trees. Monks copied manuscripts inside small wooden buildings that smelled faintly of ink and animal skin parchment. The presence of the new religion brought changes in law, in burial customs, in social organization, and in the way people understood their place in the world. Yet even as crosses replaced older symbols, the shift unfolded gradually, with many communities holding onto elements of their earlier beliefs for generations. The transition was a blending, not an erasure, as new rituals layered themselves gently atop the old. The political landscape continued its steady consolidation. Kings in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden strengthened their authority through alliances, marriages, trade, and military organization. Denmark under Knut the Great became the center of a vast North Sea empire, uniting England, Denmark, and Norway under a single ruler for a brief but significant period. This empire was not held through brute force alone, but through careful governance, respect for local customs, and the establishment of laws that allowed multiple cultures to coexist under a broader rule. Although this political unity would not last long beyond Knut's death, it demonstrated the extent to which Scandinavian influence had grown and how deeply it was intertwined with the wider European world as kings expanded their administrative reach. They built towns that served as centers for trade, law, and craftsmanship. These towns became gathering points where merchants negotiated prices over bundles of wool and furs, where ironworkers shaped tools that would be traded across the Baltic, and where ships were built for both commerce and defense. The presence of coins increased, reflecting a shift from barter-based exchange to a monetary economy. Traders traveling from Germany, England, Russia, and the Baltic interacted in these markets, bringing with them new ideas, customs, and technologies. Life in the countryside, however, continued in its steady, familiar rhythm. Most people still lived on farms surrounded by fields and forests, growing barley and rye, tending sheep and cattle, and gathering hay for winter. The farmhouse remained the heart of rural life, a place where food was prepared, wool was spun, tools were repaired, and stories were shared. Children learned from their parents, imitating the motions of farming, spinning, and weaving long before they fully understood the significance of the tasks. The pace of life was slow, shaped by the seasons, by the weather, and by the communal effort needed to sustain each family through the cold months. Even as political and religious structures changed, the Norse cultural identity remained strong. Their language, Old Norse, continued to flourish, spoken in homes, markets, and assemblies. Their legal traditions evolved into written codes, such as the laws of Iceland, which were recited from memory each year at the Althing before being written down. Their artistic styles remained distinct, characterized by intricate interlacing patterns, stylized animals, and geometric designs that adorned wood, metal, stone, and fabric. These artistic traditions captured the continuity of a culture rooted in craftsmanship and symbol. The sagas and poems that emerged from this period offer a quiet yet powerful window into the Norse worldview. These texts, written down after centuries of oral transmission, follow the lives of settlers, families, explorers, and leaders. They are composed in a steady, measured cadence, filled with details of daily life, descriptions of landscapes, and reflections on honor, fate, and responsibility. The sagas do not rush. They unfold gradually, like long winter nights filled with patient storytelling. Their language carries the same calm weight that had shaped Norse identity for centuries. As political structures solidified and religious practices evolved, the outward expansion that had characterized earlier centuries became less central to Norse life. Fewer longships set out on dangerous voyages across unknown waters. The need for far-reaching expeditions diminished as trade routes became more stable and as Scandinavian kingdoms began focusing on internal development rather than exploration. The era of great voyages was slowly giving way to an era of governance, organization, and integration with the wider medieval world. Nevertheless, the connections forged during the Viking Age continued to influence Europe in profound ways. In England, Norse influence shaped language, law, and place names. In Normandy, Descendants of Norse settlers became powerful rulers who would leave a lasting mark on European history. In the east, the networks established by Swedish traders and navigators contributed to the formation of early states that connected the Baltic to the Byzantine Empire. The DNA of the Viking Age remained woven into the fabric of many regions, subtle but enduring that as you breathe slowly, imagine the late Viking world settling into a calmer phase. The clang of blacksmiths still echoed through workshops, but many of the weapons they forged were now intended for local defense or ceremonial use rather than overseas raids. Ships still lined Scandinavian harbors, but many were built for fishing or trade rather than long-distance journeys. Stories of ancient voyages were still told, but now with the distant tone of legend, softened by time and memory. The children who listened to these stories grew up not with the expectation of exploring far horizons, but with the understanding that their future lay in the growing towns and farms of their homeland. The gradual shift of the Viking Age into the medieval Scandinavian kingdoms did not erase the past. It carried it forward in quiet, persistent ways. The Norse sense of independence, resilience, and craftsmanship continued to shape the culture. Their maritime skills remained unmatched. Their stories, both mythic and historical, continued to be told around fires during long winter nights. Their deep connection to the land and sea endured, and so, the Viking Age, which had begun with the slow spread of ships along familiar coasts, now moved gently toward its final chapters. But its influence, far from fading, flowed forward into new political systems, new artistic traditions, and new stories that captured its legacy for centuries to come. As the 12th century approached, the final phase of the Viking Age unfolded with the same quiet inevitability that had shaped its beginning. The world was changing around Scandinavia, not with sudden upheaval, but with a steady transformation that flowed through the centuries like a slow, deep current beneath still waters. The rhythms of earlier times remained present, the soft glow of hearth fires, the creaking of wooden beams in winter, the gentle movement of boats along the coast. But a new era had taken shape, one defined by organized kingdoms, established religious structures, and deeper integration into the broader medieval world. If you picture Scandinavia during this period, you see a landscape familiar yet subtly altered. The same fjords stretch into the mountains, the same forests whisper in the wind, and the same cold northern seas trace the edges of the land. But now towns are larger, markets are livelier, churches stand alongside older farmsteads, their bells carrying across fields where farmers harvest grain beneath the late summer sun. Monasteries, small but purposeful, copy manuscripts, cultivate herbs, and act as centers of learning. Slowly, a written tradition is taking root, complementing the old oral culture that had preserved stories for centuries. The legal systems, once tied closely to regional assemblies and spoken tradition, now became more formalized. Laws were written down, preserving a structure that had existed for generations. These legal codes captured not only practical rules but also values that had shaped Norse society. Fairness, community responsibility, compensation rather than revenge, and the importance of personal honor. The careful transcription of these laws shows a culture transitioning from oral memory to written record, but without abandoning its identity. It was a gentle evolution, like the shift of twilight into night, where one shade fades naturally into another. In everyday life, farming remained central. Families prepared their fields in spring, sowed seeds, cared for animals, and harvested in autumn with the same steady dedication that had sustained their ancestors. Fishing continued to play an essential role, especially along the coasts of Norway and Denmark, where herring, cod, and other fish supported both local diets and trade networks. Men and women spun wool, wove cloth, shaped pottery, brewed ale, and crafted tools. These tasks, repeated year after year, connected people to their land and to each other. Even as the outside world changed, the quiet constancy of northern life anchored communities to familiar rhythms. Trade, however, expanded significantly. Scandinavian merchants traveled to Germany, England, and the Baltic cities, exchanging goods such as timber, wool, iron, and fish for salt, textiles, spices, and luxury items. Towns along the Baltic coast grew in importance, connecting Scandinavia to the rising Hanseatic League. Trade routes became more established, and foreign coins circulated more widely. This flow of goods brought prosperity, but also new ideas, technologies, and influences that continued to reshape Scandinavian society in subtle ways. Christianity deepened its hold, guiding the construction of stone churches, the formation of dioceses, and the establishment of organized clergy. Sermons, rituals, and feast days became part of the annual cycle, blending into the traditional calendar that still followed the seasons closely. But while religious identity shifted, many older customs persisted. Seasonal feasts, midsummer traditions, and practices rooted in respect for nature. The slow blending of old and new created a cultural landscape that was layered, familiar, and uniquely Scandinavian. The transition from the Viking Age into the medieval Scandinavian kingdoms was also reflected in foreign relations. Raids became rare, replaced by diplomacy, alliances, and participation in continental political affairs. Scandinavian kings corresponded with rulers in England, Germany, and France. Marriages forged ties between royal families, ensuring peace and cooperation. Scandinavian warriors continued to serve abroad, but now as part of formal armies rather than independent expeditions. The spirit of exploration remained alive, but now channeled through organized voyages, trade, and cultural exchange. Yet even as the outward expansion slowed, the memory of earlier centuries remained strong. Stories of long voyages, distant lands, and brave ancestors were still told beside fires during long winter nights. Children listened with wide eyes as elders recalled journeys to Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. These stories became part of the cultural identity, a reminder of where the people had come from and what their ancestors had achieved. The sagas, shaped by generations of oral tradition, began to be written down in Iceland. They captured not only dramatic events but also the texture of daily life, the landscapes, the tensions, the quiet moments, and the enduring values of the Norse people. These texts, rich, detailed, patient, became one of the greatest legacies of the Viking world. They preserved history not through strict chronology, but through a calm, reflective voice that feels almost like the gentle murmuring of a long, unbroken memory. Reading them today is like listening to the echo of an age that has drifted into the past but still lives in words shaped with care. By the 12th century, the foundations of modern Scandinavian nations were becoming clearer. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden each developed more stable governmental structures, codified laws, and strengthened economic networks. Conflicts still occurred, as they do in all human histories, but the broader direction was toward stability and organization rather than expansion and exploration. Towns grew, influenced by European architectural styles. Royal courts formed, where poets, craftsmen, clerics, and advisors contributed to the life of the kingdom. Roads improved, connecting inland regions to coastal markets. The social fabric, once defined by kinship groups and local assemblies, now included royal administration, church authority, and a broader sense of national identity. Yet for all these changes, the essence of Scandinavian life remained deeply rooted in nature. The long winters still shaped daily rhythms, encouraging rest, reflection, and indoor work. The brief, bright summers still brought renewal, energy, and agricultural activity. The sea remained a central presence, calm one day, stormy the next, always carrying a quiet reminder of the past. People still carved wood with the same patterns their ancestors had used. They still interpreted the landscape with the same awareness sharpened by generations of living close to the land that as you breathe gently. Imagine the Viking age fading not like a flame extinguished, but like a long day settling slowly into dusk. Nothing disappears suddenly. Instead, the light softens, the edges blur, and the world transitions gradually from one state to another. This is how the Viking age came to its close, through continuity rather than rupture, through gentle transformation rather than dramatic ending. The seeds planted during centuries of exploration, trade, and cultural exchange continued to grow into the medieval Scandinavian kingdoms. Their maritime expertise, their craftsmanship, their stories, and their adaptability all became woven into the fabric of the new era. The Viking Age lived on, not as a distant memory, but as a quiet foundation beneath the emerging world. As the 12th century continued to unfold, the final layers of the Viking Age settled gently across Scandinavia, completing a long transformation that had taken place over generations. The world that had once given rise to daring voyages, coastal settlements, and far-reaching trade networks was now shaped by stable kingdoms, established churches, and increasingly organized communities. And yet, beneath these new structures, the memory of earlier centuries still rested quietly, like the foundation stones beneath a growing town. Steady and enduring, the landscapes remained unchanged, shaped by glaciers and ancient forests long before human stories began. Fjords still cut deep into the coastline, their waters reflecting the muted light of northern skies. Meadows filled with grazing cattle and sheep still followed the rhythm of the seasons. Villages continued to gather around the warmth of hearth fires during long winter nights. What changed, slowly and gradually, was the way people understood their place in this landscape and their connection to the broader world beyond it. This time, stone churches replaced many of the earlier wooden structures. Their thick walls and simple architecture gave communities a sense of permanence, anchoring them to both local tradition and the wider European Christian world. Bells rang clearly over fields and rivers, marking hours of prayer and times of gathering. Churchyards became places not only of worship but of community memory, where ancestors rested and generations overlapped. These spaces reflected a new rhythm of life, structured, peaceful, and connected to a sense of shared identity. Monasteries also played a growing role. Though small in number, they became centers of learning, agriculture, and craftsmanship. Monks copied manuscripts, preserved knowledge, tended gardens, and taught reading and writing to those who sought education. The presence of written records strengthened the transition from oral tradition to documented history, fostering a culture that blended older storytelling practices with emerging literary forms. This slow shift toward written preservation ensured that centuries of experience would not fade with memory, but would be carried into the future. In political life, Scandinavian kingdoms developed deeper administrative structures. Kings relied on councils, legal assemblies, and clergy for governance, while regional leaders adapted to new forms of authority. Military obligations became more formalized, replacing earlier community-based structures with organized systems of service. Trade agreements, diplomatic missions, and alliances tied Scandinavia to the rest of Europe in ways that would have been unfamiliar to earlier generations. Yet the core values of independence, cooperation, and respect for law remained constant, guiding these evolving political systems. Economically, the region grew more connected to European trade. Fishing remained essential, especially in Norway, where dried fish became a significant export. Denmark and Sweden expanded agricultural production, sending grain, timber, and iron southward. In return, foreign merchants brought fine cloth, spices, salt, metal goods, and cultural influences that subtly reshaped Scandinavian towns and markets. Coastal trade routes strengthened, and new connections formed with the growing Baltic cities, further integrating the North into international commerce. Everyday life for most people, however, continued to revolve around familiar routines. Homes were built with wood and earth, warmed by central hearths. Families cooked bread, stews, and grains much as their ancestors had. Children learned tasks by watching their parents, tending animals, repairing tools, spinning wool, weaving cloth. Seasonal festivities marked the passage of time, blending Christian holidays with older customs tied to nature's cycles. These traditions persisted softly, forming a cultural continuity that stretched back further than anyone could remember. Art and craftsmanship flourished in new ways. Carved wooden beams still featured interlacing designs inspired by ancient motifs, while metalworkers crafted brooches, buckles, and ornaments with patterns that carried echoes of earlier centuries. Stone carving evolved as well, with runestones gradually giving way to Christian crosses, each reflecting a stage in the cultural transition. The details etched into these objects, curving lines, stylized animals, intertwined shapes, held onto the artistic language of the past even as they adapted to new meanings. The sagas, written in Iceland during this period, captured the emotional and historical depth of the Viking world with extraordinary clarity. They did not romanticize or exaggerate. Instead, they presented life as it was: complex, steady, interconnected with land, family, law, and tradition. These writings preserved the memory of early settlers, explorers, and families, not through epic spectacle but through quiet detail and reflective storytelling. The sagas became one of the greatest gifts of the Viking Age to the world, a window into a society that valued both strength and restraint, honor and practicality, independence and community. As Scandinavian society settled into its new forms, the old patterns of long-distance raiding and expansion faded naturally. The need for such voyages diminished as kingdoms stabilized and trade networks expanded through peaceful means. Coastal defenses still existed, but they served more to maintain order than to prepare for distant expeditions. Ships continued to be built, but more for commerce and travel than for warfare. Longships, once symbols of exploration, came to represent heritage rather than daily necessity. And yet, the influence of earlier centuries remained woven into the identity of the people. Their exceptional shipbuilding skills shaped maritime traditions for generations. Their knowledge of winds, currents, and coastal navigation never disappeared. Their legacy abroad in England, Normandy, Ireland, Scotland, Russia, and beyond remained evident in language, law, architecture, and cultural memory. The Norse exploration of the North Atlantic, reaching Iceland, Greenland, and North America, became part of a long, quiet story of human movement and curiosity that stretched beyond their era. As the medieval period deepened, Scandinavia's place in Europe became clearer. The region was no longer seen as distant or isolated, but as a stable part of a larger cultural and political landscape. Kings negotiated treaties, participated in European affairs, and supported trade that connected the north to distant regions. Towns grew into early cities. Written chronicles described events year by year. The quiet stability of the region, once shaped by harsh winters and rugged landscapes, now stood as a strength that supported long-term development. Yet despite all of these changes, the spirit of the Viking Age did not fade. It lingered gently in the way stories were told, in the patterns carved into wood and metal, in the traditions passed down through generations, and in the deep connection people felt to sea and land. It remained in the cultural memory, not as a time of endless conflict, but as a period of adaptability, exploration, and resilience that shaped the identity of the North. The Viking Age, which had begun with quiet coastal settlements and grown into a far-reaching web of voyages and cultural exchange, now rested peacefully in the background of history. Its legacy continued forward, steady and silent, like the distant echo of waves along the shore. As the centuries continued to move forward, the final transformation of the Viking Age into the fully medieval world unfolded with the same slow and steady rhythm that had always defined life in the North. Nothing ended abruptly. Instead, the customs, beliefs, and lifestyles of earlier generations gradually settled into new forms, each shaped by the changing needs and influences of the time. Scandinavia, once known for its explorers and seafarers, now became recognized for its stability, its craftsmanship, its evolving political structures, and its growing engagement with the wider European world. By the late 12th century, the kingdoms of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden had solidified their territories more clearly. Borders were still flexible in some regions, but the overall structure of each realm had become recognizable, with kings reigning over lands supported by councils, regional leaders, and established legal systems. The process had taken generations, evolving gently from decentralized communities into organized monarchies where laws, assemblies, and written records strengthened the foundations of governance. Yet in many ways, these medieval kingdoms still carried the memory of earlier traditions. Local assemblies, communal judgments, and the importance of personal honor remained deeply valued. Christianity, which had slowly intertwined with everyday life, now shaped cultural expressions across Scandinavia. Churches held seasonal festivals, and their bells marked the flow of time. Yet older customs persisted quietly, woven into celebrations, agricultural practices, and community gatherings. People continued to honor the rhythms of nature, observe the cycles of the sun, and celebrate seasonal transitions, blending them softly with the newer religious calendar. This blending preserved continuity while welcoming change, forming a cultural identity that was both ancient and evolving in Iceland. The sagas continued to be written, expanding into a vast literary tradition that preserved not only the events of the Viking Age, but also the wisdom and worldview of the Norse people. These texts recorded genealogies, legal disputes, voyages, and moments of daily life, written in a style that was calm, measured, and reflective. The sagas were not simply stories. They were a way of preserving memory, identity, and the deep connection between people and their land. Their creation represents one of the most remarkable cultural achievements of the medieval North, offering a quiet and enduring bridge between the past and the present. Trade expanded steadily. The Baltic Sea became a major hub of commerce, connecting Scandinavia with merchants from Germany, Poland, Russia, and the growing Hanseatic cities. Timber, iron, fish, and furs traveled outward, while salt, grain, fine textiles, and crafted goods flowed inward. These exchanges enriched Scandinavian towns and introduced new ideas, technologies, and artistic influences. Markets grew more diverse. Craftsmen adapted their techniques. Foreign coins circulated widely, marking the shift toward a more integrated economic world. In rural areas, life remained grounded in the familiar tasks of farming and seasonal work. Families continued to cultivate grain, raise livestock, and gather resources from forests and rivers. Homes were built with familiar materials: wood, turf, stone, arranged in ways that reflected practical needs shaped by centuries of experience. The hearth remained the heart of the home, offering warmth, food, and light during long winter nights. People still gathered around fires to share stories, teach children, and reflect on the rhythms of their lives. This constancy, steady and quiet, connected the medieval North to its deeper past. Along the coasts, shipbuilding continued, refined by generations of maritime knowledge. The sleek longships of earlier centuries became symbols more than practical tools. Yet the skills required to build them remained alive. Boats were still crafted for fishing, trade, and coastal travel, each shaped by hands that understood the language of wood and water. The sea, always present and always influential, continued to guide the rhythms of life. It offered food, connected communities, and carried memories of journeys that stretched far beyond the horizon. The influence of the Viking Age remained evident abroad as well. In England, the imprint of Norse settlement persisted in place names, linguistic expressions, and regional identities. In Normandy, the descendants of Norse settlers shaped powerful political dynasties, including those who would play major roles in medieval European history. In the East, the networks established by Swedish traders continued to influence early state formations and cultural developments. These enduring legacies illustrated how deeply interconnected the Viking world had been, and how widely its effects had spread. That as you breathe slowly, imagine the Viking Age resting gently beneath the surface of history, not gone, but quietly present. The stories told to children still carried echoes of earlier centuries. The patterns carved into wood and stone still followed ancient motifs. The sense of resilience, independence, and exploration remained woven into the cultural identity of the North. Even as new institutions rose, the memory of the past provided a steady foundation, like the deep, firm roots of an old tree that continues to grow new branches. By the end of the 12th century and the beginning of the 13th, the medieval Scandinavian kingdoms were fully part of European cultural, political, and economic systems. They contributed to intellectual exchange, religious development, trade growth, and diplomatic relations. Their stability allowed for new forms of art, architecture, and literature to flourish. Towns expanded into early cities. Stone construction became more common. Education gradually spread. Life became more structured, but the gentle continuity with earlier centuries softened the transition. And yet, no matter how much changed, the essence of the northern world, its closeness to nature, its patient rhythms, its deep sense of community remained constant. The mountains, forests, and seas continued their quiet watch. The seasons still shaped daily routines. The people still moved through their days with a calm awareness of the landscape that had supported countless generations before them. The Viking Age, though now far in the past, remained alive in spirit. It lived in the stories written on parchment, in the traditions quietly upheld, in the artistic patterns that endured, and in the maritime expertise passed from hand to hand. Its legacy did not end. It transformed, softened, and continued forward into a new era. By the time the 13th century arrived, the transformation that had begun centuries earlier had fully settled across Scandinavia, bringing the Viking Age to its quiet close. No single moment marked its ending. Instead, it faded softly, gradually, like the dimming of a long northern twilight that merges seamlessly into night. The world that had once produced explorers, settlers, traders, and warriors had become something new, rooted in the same land and the same traditions, yet reshaped by evolving beliefs, expanding trade, and stable political structures. The story of the Viking Age did not vanish. It simply moved into a new chapter. In Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, the medieval kingdoms matured. Royal courts established clear systems of law, governance, and taxation. Stone churches and early cathedrals stood where wooden structures once stood, their architecture reflecting European influences while blending naturally with the northern landscape. Towns grew into important centers of commerce, connecting inland farms with distant markets. The use of writing expanded, allowing laws, chronicles, and sagas to be recorded in ways that previous generations could only have imagined. These developments brought Scandinavia firmly into the medieval European world, not as an isolated frontier, but as a region with its own strengths, its own artistry, and its own cultural identity. Yet the essence of northern life remained closely tied to nature. The seasons still dictated agricultural cycles. Winters remained long and introspective, offering time for families to gather around warm hearths and share stories that had been passed through generations. Summers were still brief and bright, filled with planting, harvesting, fishing, and preparation for the colder months ahead. Even as societies became more structured, the natural world remained the foundation of daily life, shaping everything from work to community gatherings to spiritual traditions. The legacy of the Viking Age continued in the form of craftsmanship that carried its distinct artistic styles forward. Wood carvers traced familiar interwoven patterns onto beams and household objects. Metalworkers created brooches, buckles, and tools with designs reminiscent of earlier centuries. Textile artists wove fabrics that balanced beauty and practicality, using natural dyes and traditional methods. These skills formed an unbroken chain linking the medieval world with the generations that had come before, quietly preserving the identity of the North. The sagas, written largely in Iceland during this era, ensured that the memory of the Viking Age would endure. They offered detailed accounts of exploration, settlement, law, family conflict, poetry, and the deep connection between people and their land. Their calm, measured storytelling style captured the subtle rhythms of life, reflecting a worldview shaped by patience, resilience, and a profound awareness of nature. These texts became one of the greatest cultural treasures of the North, preserving history through narrative rather than conquest, and offering future generations a window into a world both distant and familiar. Meanwhile, the influence of the Viking Age continued to shape regions far beyond Scandinavia. In England, Norse heritage remained visible in countless place names, legal customs, and linguistic roots. In Normandy, the descendants of Norse settlers helped shape powerful political dynasties, influencing the future of France and beyond. In Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man, Norse culture blended with local traditions, leaving behind a legacy seen in art, language, and archaeological remains. And in Eastern Europe, the trade routes and early state building influenced by Swedish traders continued to echo through centuries of cultural development. The maritime expertise developed during the Viking Age did not disappear either. Scandinavians continued to build ships with a deep understanding of wind, current, and coastline. They remained connected to the sea, not through distant raids, but through fishing, coastal travel, and trade that supported their growing economies. The sea, always present and always powerful, remained a symbol of the northern spirit, calm at times, fierce at others, and endlessly connected to the world beyond the horizon. As you breathe slowly, imagine the Viking Age resting beneath the surface of the medieval world like calm water beneath drifting ice. It is no longer the dominant force shaping events, yet it remains a strong foundation beneath everything that followed. The early explorations of the North Atlantic opened pathways that later generations would rediscover. The cultural exchanges forged through trade and settlement influenced countless regions. The stories and sagas kept alive the memory of the values that had shaped the Norse people: resilience, adaptability, community, and a deep respect for the natural world. By the end of the medieval period, Scandinavia had become a region defined by stable kingdoms, written law, Christian tradition, and flourishing trade. And yet, the cultural memory of the Viking Age never faded. It continued to inspire art, literature, identity, and curiosity. It lived quietly in the way people saw their landscapes, honored their traditions, taught their children, and remembered their ancestors. The Viking Age became not an era of conquest or conflict, but a source of heritage, an enduring story carried gently through time and the modern world. The legacy of the Viking Age remains visible in many ways. Archaeological discoveries reveal longships, tools, textiles, and carvings that speak to extraordinary craftsmanship. Languages across Europe still carry Norse words. Historical studies continue to uncover new details. Festivals, reenactments, and cultural events celebrate traditions shaped more by historical understanding than myth. Museums display artifacts that connect people to a world over 1,000 years old. And the quiet landscapes of Scandinavia still hold traces of the past. Ancient farm boundaries, burial mounds, runestones weathered by centuries, and fjords that look much the same as they did to the earliest Norse settlers. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy lies in the human spirit, the curiosity that led explorers across unknown seas, the resilience that allowed communities to endure harsh climates, the craftsmanship that merged beauty with function, and the storytelling tradition that preserved memory with patience and care. These qualities transcend time. They continue to inspire people around the world who look to the Viking Age not as a distant chapter, but as a reminder of what human beings have always been capable of when they face the world with courage, creativity, and connection to their surroundings. And so, as the journey through this history comes to a peaceful close, the Viking Age rests not as something lost, but as something lasting. Its traces remain in the land, in the stories, in the languages, and in the quiet endurance of northern culture. It lives on gently, woven into the fabric of centuries, reminding us that even the most dramatic eras eventually settle into memory, carried forward not by noise but by the soft, steady passage of time.